if people join late, but I think it's a
Very
good
good,
start.
very good. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Can I just say to the two or three participants who are present, which is great, but who are not visible, it's not compulsory. Obviously, you can keep your camera off if you want to, but I think for the speakers, it's particularly nice if they can see you, so that they're not just addressing a black screen, and they can see some reaction to what they're saying, looks of horror or nods or shaking of heads. So entirely up to you, but feel free to put your camera on if you can. So I'm Stephen Hockman. I am a former chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers. I am, as John Denham or somebody implied a few minutes ago, a lawyer, having been in practice for quite a long time. And more to the point, perhaps, I am one of the two co-chairs of the Society of Labour Lawyers Housing and Levelling Up group. And the clue is in the name. The Housing and Levelling Up group covers levelling up, and we thought that it was about time we had a webinar, and we thought it was about time we got some people who would be able to talk to us about levelling up and how Labour is likely to approach it going forward. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to the first of our speakers. I'll introduce all of them, and I'm going to hand over to the speakers. Each of them is going to talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. Let me encourage you during the course of all this, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, put it in the chat. Equally, you can wait until we get to questions and then just raise a hand, a physical one or a digital one. I can call on you to ask your question. We can do this, any way you like, depending on how many questions there are and all of that. So, but you can use the chat function by all means if you want to. I think that's probably all I need to say by way of preliminary, except I'm just going to introduce this topic myself with one question. And I'm only saying this today because oddly enough, it's the first time it's ever occurred to me, although it's such an obvious point. This phrase levelling up, I suspect, is really a Tory phrase, in as far as it means that we should have as a socio-economic objective making all parts of the country equally prosperous. I suspect that if that's what it means, then Labour could probably sign up to a concept of that kind, if you agree. But levelling up in the sense that which seems to presuppose that you can increase the prosperity of those parts of the country where it's not so great at the moment, without in any way prejudicing the southeast or other parts of the country where there is great prosperity. In other words, you don't have to do anything to impact on the southeast. You can do the whole thing painlessly as far as the southeast is concerned. That is perhaps a typical Tory approach, but I'm not so sure that Labour will agree with it. But that's just one little thought that our speakers might care to deal with, or you might want to come to in questions. Right, so who are the speakers? First of all, it's a great pleasure to meet and to introduce Emma Foodie, who is Assistant General Secretary of the Cooperative Party. She has held various regional positions for the Labour Party and has been involved in the governance of non-profit social housing providers, and she has sat as a magistrate. So that's a pretty broad CV to kick off with. I should say that Emma can't stay with us throughout, and so I might well see if anybody's got questions or comments for Emma when she's finished speaking. So if you have, do think of them and be ready to put them to her in about 15 minutes' time. Then we'll have John Denham, as has already been recognised. He was an MP for over 20 years from 1992, and he ended up as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in the Labour government, the Brown government, 2009-2010. And then he left Parliament and he became a professorial fellow on English identity and politics at Southampton University. And although he stressed earlier that he's not a lawyer, he has been kind enough to work quite a lot with some of us on various socio-legal topics. So he must have imbibed a little bit of legal acumen as a result of all that. And it's a delight to have his collaboration. And thirdly, a pure lawyer, a lawyer who is entirely pure, I'm sure, Bren Alveston. He's a solicitor at Stevenson Harwood. He's got a wide-ranging private practice, and he's been a long-term Labour Party member. And he is co-chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers Constitution Group. The relevance of that will become obvious in the course of the next hour or so. So I think that's all that I need to do for the moment by way of introduction. So Emma, thank you again, and let me hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Just checking I've come off mute there. Thanks, Stephen. And thank you for having me along this evening. It's a great pleasure to join everyone and to be on a panel with John and Bren to talk about this, which, as you've already touched on, is such an important issue for our party to grapple with, but also for the country more generally. So my name is Emma Foodie. As has been said, I'm currently Assistant General Secretary at the Co-operative Party, and it's great to see on the call today some of our members and hopefully some of our future members as well joining us this evening. But I promise what I'm going to say isn't going to be a party political broadcast for the Co-operative Party as such, but it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to be advocating for cooperative solutions to the challenges that we face, particularly when we're talking about this particular agenda. So for those of you, for the benefit of those who don't necessarily know a great deal about the Co-operative Party, we are the sister party of the Labour Party. We've been sister parties for over a century now, and we stand joint candidates, whether in Parliament, whether in Holyrood, in the Senate, and we've got the majority of our Labour Police and Crime Commissioners are co-op candidates, the vast majority of our mayoral candidates, and indeed we've got more than 1,500 local councillors up and down the country. And we are to the cooperative movement what the Labour Party is to the trade union movement. We are, dating back to the Rochdale pioneers, our cooperative history. And our analysis is a really straightforward one. Ultimately, it is that services and organisations and companies are better run when the people who use them or who work for them or who are affected by them have a say and a stake in what happens with them. And so I think that analysis matches pretty neatly actually with the subject of levelling up. As was said when people were chatting just a moment ago, levelling up, of course, it's a financial issue, it's an economic issue, but we would certainly argue that it's also an issue of power. And that's because levelling up ultimately is an inside job. As we've seen just this week with the latest handing out of sweeties from central government that is supposed to help so-called left-behind communities. And whilst we would never decry cash-strapped towns getting some money, some of the money back that has been cut so massively from their budgets, that is so far away from what levelling up actually can and should be. And whilst it might lead to a improvement in the physical fabric of the of these communities, it won't ultimately address the underlying issues which has led them to where they are. Because what we need to be able to do that is we need to see a really fundamental shift in power and the resources that come along with that. And that's an analysis that says that local communities know their strengths and weaknesses better than the centre does ultimately. they're better placed to shape their local economies, to create local solutions, and to use their local economies to indeed create a national economy where it is not just a small number of people in a small part of the country that can ultimately thrive as a consequence of that. And, you know, the issues that we're grappling with here, that we're talking about, these kind of spatial, regional issues of inequality, you know, I'm delighted that I've managed to work with the Labour movement and campaigning with the Labour movement in different countries, in different parts of the world, in trying to ensure Labour governments and Labour solutions. These issues are not unique to our country. They are issues that are being faced in Australia, that are being faced in America, that are being faced in all sorts of different countries. But what doesn't change is that we have to get a handle on them, and we have to be able to grapple with them properly for us to really move the dial on this, and for us to be able to benefit the communities that we ultimately seek to serve. But you know, the Labour Party's commitment to a Take Back Control Act is a really welcome one. And it's really important and pleasing to see that there are crucial commitments within there on skills, on the DWP and inward investment, which mean that communities will have greater agency and have greater control. And we already, of course, see our existing devolved metro mayors and mayors, whether it's Andy Burnham or others, great Labour cooperative mayors who are finding solutions to issues like public transport. But it's really crucial that all communities have access to these powers, and it's really incumbent on a future Labour government to be able to find creative ways, perhaps with governance, that allow for this to actually happen. But co-ops ultimately will form an important part of that future economy, actually. Cooperative organisations, cooperative business are more resilient to financial challenges, they hire more diversely, they retain money in communities in which it is ultimately raised. And our big headline ask from the Labour Party going into the next general government, along with another couple, but the headline one is to double the size of the cooperative sector. Cooperative enterprise in every town, at the heart of every community, is a really important part of levelling up, of ensuring that town centres are improved and that we see this greater distribution of wealth and power in these communities. So whilst talking about a transfer of power, if you like, from Whitehall to regional and sub-regional bodies like combined authorities is a good one, it is in and of itself not really enough, because this is an agenda that has to be fundamental to restoring trust in our democracy, trust which we know isn't as strong as we would like it to be. We know we would like to see it greater. So if people only see a transfer of power from the centre to another sub-regional body that's further away from them potentially than their council, then that's not really enough. And so our campaign is for proper community power. And what we mean by that is a shift of power down to community level. And we do have a tradition in this space with John and his colleagues responsible for the big local programme that invested in community capacity to shape place. And we really welcome the Labour Party's recent commitments around the community right to buy, so that we can make sure that assets actually stay within our community hands. We want to see an accompanying commitment on a community right to have a say in public services as well. But taken together, proper devolution for everyone and community power, I believe that this is a really compelling package actually that can reshape our democracy and can have a real long-lasting impact for our communities and a legacy with it. And hopefully we are at that change moment, less than, 18 months at the most away from the next general election. This is a truly genuine change moment for us in the Labour Party, but for our communities up and down the country as well. And these ultimately are the changes that we're going to be fighting for in that election. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very, very much. Very succinct and very interesting. So as I said, we might just pause for a moment to see if people have questions or comments for Emma. I have one. Let me kick this off. One thing I was particularly interested in from the various things that you said was your thought that ideally, what we should have in the areas whose prosperity we're trying to improve is cooperative businesses. And I think you said that your aim is, or you think that Labour's aim should be to double the number of cooperative businesses when it comes to power. And I said when. But could you just expand a little bit on how that might be achieved? I mean, I suppose at one extreme, you could pass a law that said that every business now has to be a cooperative, but that might not necessarily be practical. But are there steps that central government or local government can take to encourage or stimulate or even insist on businesses being cooperative?
Thanks, Stephen. At the moment, central government doesn't spend a single pound on ensuring cooperative growth or more cooperative solutions to the business challenges that we see, and also the challenges within our communities more generally. So I think that central government doing anything would feel like a real big step forward in this space. What we've actually got at the moment, which we've seen from our Labour and cooperative mayors, though, is again with kind of the levers and the opportunities that devolution has been able to bring them so far, but which with potentially kind of further devolution they could do so much more with, is around ownership hubs. So Oliver Coppard, for example, has an ownership hub in South Yorkshire, which looks to support local organisations, local groups of people who are looking to develop ideas, to develop businesses, to see whether there is alternative models which can actually be more productive and more beneficial for the community than necessarily going down a particular kind of PLC route. So we've already kind of got that, which is happening. But seeing more ownership hubs, seeing something like that in every region would be something that's really positive. Again, because of the kind of patchwork that we have at the moment of devolution, where some people get various parts of various powers, some people get others, it means that it's a real kind of patchwork quilt up and down the country. But there are also really strong commitments that the Labour Party has made through working with the Cooperative Party as well around increasing the number of cooperatives. For example, we've been working closely with Ed Miliband around the local power plan, and the local power plan is a key tenet of that is around community energy. And community energy, again, in the kind of in the cooperative tradition, is about ensuring that communities have control or more control of energy production or other aspects of energy within their particular areas. And the Labour Party is committed to particular grants and also loans to local authorities and to community groups to encourage these startups to create 1 million owners of community energy. 1 million new owners of community energy is a fundamental commitment from the Labour Party at the next general election, which will make such a big difference to the way energy is produced at the moment, and to the reliance that we currently have on oil trade fluctuations, on all those kind of external forces, but also will fundamentally increase the number of cooperatives as a direct consequence of that as well. So there's kind of I think there's particular answers around devolution, there's particular answers around legislation, but there's also kind of looking more broadly at not just how do we make it easier for people to set up cooperatives, but also think about, well, actually what solutions are currently available that if we make easier, it actually allows those to flourish as well.
Presumably you wouldn't, you wouldn't need to, I presume cooperative businesses don't necessarily abandon the idea of limited liability. It's just that the owners or shareholders in the business tend to be the people who are actually running and working in the business, rather than, as is normally the case, people who have actually no connection with the business whatsoever, other than the fact that they own shares, the value of which they hope will increase. So is that right? Have I got that more or less right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point that you've touched on at the moment. And this isn't saying that there aren't responsible private businesses who care about their communities or not by any stretch, but there are too many who don't and who are happy to profit from the wealth creation that exists within a community without necessarily wanting to invest within it and to support that community otherwise.
Excellent. Okay. Well, for anybody who joined late, we've just heard from Emma Foodie, and because she has to go, not straight away, but a little bit later, we're having a little question and answer session with her. There's a couple of hands up. Right. Can we go to Hannah next, please?
Thank you. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm not sure I know many in the room. I'm a counsellor in Islington. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in political theory, and I chair the Fabian's Law and Constitution Policy Group. Thanks, Anna. I really enjoyed those remarks. I'm going to ask you a bit about how you think that these devolution packages could best, or how we could best get devolution right for local business. So obviously you have the cooperative bent, but thinking a bit more broadly beyond that. So the power of the Brown Report, of course, was to link these questions of inequality of economic and social power, importantly, to these constitutional questions. I suspect that the big job for Labour is going to be explaining in a clear way in our manifesto how that link is made and how that can be really impactful in delivering power back to communities, as you say, should be the aim. So what do you think needs to be devolved to empower local areas to foster local economies? There's some reasonably lukewarm commitments, I think, on the table, job centres being one of the stronger pieces of that. But it'd be interesting to hear from you what you think is necessary. Thank you.
Shall we let's just take the question from Alex as well, and then Emma, you can hopefully cover both. I'll just say to Hannah that if you want to raise the questions that you have raised, you come to the right place, because I suspect that in addition to no doubt interesting comments you get from Emma, you'll get a few from Bren and from John as well on some of those topics. But we'll hear from Alex first and then from Emma. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. My question is not unrelated. Thank you. My question is not unrelated to Hannah's, actually. To introduce myself, I am a commercial lawyer living in Yorkshire, north of Yorkshire, and chair of a local constituency Labour Party. One thing, it's a rural community that I live in, made up of towns and villages. And one thing that is prevalent in the sorts of areas that sorts are in our communities are community assets like village halls, social centres, pubs, and sort of town and village high street buildings, commercial and residential, that perhaps are run down or in disrepair. I suppose you talked about community assets, Emma, which was is an interesting idea. I'm interested to know where you've got owners of those assets who are less interested in a community cooperative model taking ownership of them. What powers do you think are realistic in order to be able for the community to grasp them and maintain them and operate them in a way that benefits the community, rather than, as you've said, as was alluded to earlier, for the commercial benefit of the owners of them? It makes me think of compulsory purchase powers, but they seem somewhat draconian. So I'm wondering how, in practice, be that through organizational infrastructure or actually just legal powers, that could be achieved.
Thank you. So Emma, back to you, just maybe 3 or 4 minutes max, if you wouldn't mind, and then we can move on to the next speaker.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks both Alex and Hannah for those particular questions. I mean, I think that what is really important in these conversations around devolution for all communities is recognizing that there's not a one size fits all kind of approach to these things. So what works for a community in one area doesn't necessarily have the ingredients for the right answer in another area. And for issues around skills, and when we're talking about being able to kind of to to shape kind of, you know, what those things need to be, what those things need to look like for a particular area. It's about getting the conversation started as much as anything else, and actually getting these stakeholders within a room to talk about what are the needs within that particular community, so that you can shape it as a consequence of it. I mean, I know Islington was involved in the new local report that was released recently, but South Tyneside was also within that. And I thought what was really interesting with the work that South Tyneside had been doing around local recruitment and working with local businesses, local anchor institutions and other organisations to look at, well, actually, what are the recruitment needs within our area and what are the gaps, so that we can seek to support as much as we possibly can to ensure that that recruitment is able to happen locally, and that actually the skills needs which are there for our area are being fulfilled as much as we possibly can by the work that that the council is able to support. Now, as we said, with the conversation around devolution, around additional skills, whether it's job centre work, other kind of skills aspects to it, there is more opportunity to do that on an even bigger scale. And I think that that's an opportunity that we absolutely need to grasp, recognising that getting people together and having the conversation is the first step to understanding ultimately what the needs of those particular areas are. When it comes to community right to buy, I think that the greatest challenge around it at the moment, honestly, is less legislative and it's more funding. Is that it's all very well saying to a community, oh, well, sorry, you're going to lose your local pub, but don't worry, you can, if you want, seek to purchase it for the benefit of the community. Oh, sorry, there's absolutely no money or any funding available to help you do that. Then unfortunately, it just feels a more long-winded way to achieving the same inevitable outcome, which is that very few communities, or only particular communities where there is quite frankly, the money and the wealth within the area to be able to do these things, does it end up actually happening? So again, I think that the commitments from the Labour Party about funding being available for communities to do it will actually provide the greatest opportunities for community right to buy to actually take place, and for it to take place on a more sustainable basis. But I will stop there, as I think I'm about at my 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, you've got yourself priority on the questions as well as the speaking, so you haven't done too badly. But we really appreciate your participation, and when you need to go, just drop off. But
thank you so much. Thank you for having us, and I will stay on as long as I can. I'm very keen to hear all of the speakers. That's great.
So I'll hand over in a moment to John. I just want to flag up that I'm slightly comforted by the fact that the sort of legal component of this meeting has recently increased a little bit. I see my fellow SLL Housing and Levelling Up Group co-chair Liz has now joined us after no doubt a heavy day at the COVID inquiry. Liz, perhaps you weren't expecting that question. I won't press you for an answer. My friend Femi has also joined us, and you can turn your camera on if you want to, Femi. That's entirely up to you. Right, John, over to you.
Okay, Stephen, thanks very much, and it's great to follow Emma, and I'm pleased she could answer some quite detailed questions about powers that I don't feel as well equipped to talk about, so that was very useful. I'm going to talk primarily to the paper that the Society has published on its website, which was largely put together by Bren and myself. And I'm going to try and talk about some of the policy issues, and Bren will pick up on some of the legal and constitutional framework. Actually, as Emma's already mentioned, we've had examples this week about why the current policies of the current government are inadequate. The plan for towns, this £1.1 billion to 55 towns over 10 years, just £20 million per town for 10 years, nowhere near offsetting the resources lost through austerity. But more than that, each one is going to have imposed on it a complex town board. Sunak, in his introduction, made it very clear that he thought most of these councils in these areas were failures, and so they're going to instruct them to have a model of local management prescribed in Whitehall, even though most of these areas will already have some sort of partnership arrangement. And these features of government devolution policy, it's arbitrary. Some places get it, some don't. It's a top-down design. It's controlled by Whitehall. it plays to Westminster politics rather than local democracy, and ultimately is inadequate. The second example may slightly surprise you, but actually it's the successful franchising of buses in Greater Manchester by Andy Burnham. Now, that's actually a real triumph for Andy to have steered that through the complex things he needed to do. But actually, there's no absolute right for Manchester to exercise those sorts of powers. And in fact, only the 10 mayoral combined authorities have in principle the right to do it. Others would have to ask permission, and not surprisingly, none have even attempted. And when you go behind it, the mayors of Manchester or the West Midlands or the other places, or even the combined local authorities that they chair, don't have any of the strong legal constitutional basis of the Mayor of London or the Greater London Assembly. So even the mayoral system is dependent on the goodwill of Whitehall and can take that goodwill away at any time. It falls well short of entrenched powers for local government. So the first point from those two examples about any scheme Labour devises is, if we want genuine devolution, it has to be the empowerment of local government by right and not by the arbitrary discretion of central government. The second challenge is that there is, we have to recognise this, an inherent tension between different aims of devolution. So sometimes you're talking about devolution, when we're talking about towns, it's often around high streets, key public buildings, pubs, place shaping, what we've just been talking about. But then some of the initiatives of recent years, like community wealth building, where universities, hospitals, councils work together to combine their procurement policies, for example, to create local employment, to foster local small businesses, including co-ops, those take place inevitably at a wider level. And then there are some powers like strategic planning, energy, perhaps skills, research funding need to be at a wider level too. And if we're honest, on the left, this tension between sort of community empowerment, regional strategy, the tier in between, has often held us back because people have tended to divide into different schools of thought about which type of devolution we want. So my second point is that there needs to be a model of devolution that actually empowers at all three of those levels and doesn't force us to choose between one and the other. And the third point, by way of introduction, is just to stress how slow and inadequate the current process of devolution deals is. It started 10 years ago, and I can tell you that even Greater Manchester and the West Midlands have fewer powers today than local elected government did in Hampshire when I was elected as a county councillor in 1981. We have gone almost nowhere to reverse the centralisation of the last 40 years. So the third point is this: if we're serious in government, we can't just carry on with the current deal-by-deal approach. We have to have a system that can reach all parts of England quickly and enable it to create the devolved structures that make a difference. So our proposal is in three key parts. Firstly, we need to empower with statutory and constitutional powers the upper tier of local government. That is county councils, Met boroughs, unitary cities and councils. We have one of those in each part of England, and it's the appropriate size to give these powers to. Secondly, all of those empowered authorities should have the right and arguably the duty to form larger combined authorities to carry out economic and other functions that require a wider geography. These should be designed from the bottom up, not, I mean, largely where you've got them. I'm sure you'd start with what you've got, but in areas that haven't, rather than fit a predetermined Whitehall model, it should be built from local authorities upwards. And thirdly, both those empowered local authorities and combined authorities should have a statutory duty of subsidiarity. That means they would have to demonstrate, and it'd be subject to challenge, that any powers they hold would be delegated to the lowest possible level. Now, just a quick thing when I talk quickly about empowerment. What we're really talking about here is that local authorities would have certain powers that they can exercise by rights, and we've touched on a few of those. That would be set out in law. They would also have the right to draw down additional powers as needed. And rather than under the current system, you have to go cap in hand to Whitehall and say, please, 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 and Whitehall says no, the centre would have have to have good reason to refuse to hand down those powers. And similarly with combined authorities that have the right to access additional powers and to draw them down from the centre. This is remarkably different to the current arrangements. It would mean that a level of devolved power is automatically in place across England without dependence on central government approval. The process of gaining new powers is designed to be irreversible, save in the most catastrophic of circumstances. And we'd see much faster moves towards combined authorities that don't currently have them. And this is a process that puts a responsibility on central government to facilitate further devolution. Now, it's going to be a development. There's bound to be the case in some places where the capacity is lacking to take on the new powers or to use them effectively, but the obligation must be on the centre to enable people to develop that capacity. So what I've done briefly, Stephen, is to sketch out an approach in our paper. It's a consistent strategy for empowerment that moves us away from the individualized deals that we have at the moment. It gives us a flexible approach to the establishment of combined local authorities and a duty of subsidiarity. Now, what we didn't do in the paper for the Society was get involved in the detail, important though it is, of which powers should be devolved to which level, what legal powers might be available to challenge the authorities that resisted the double devolution of powers. Now, that's partly because other people are better qualified to talk about high street strategy or spatial planning or skills development. But actually, it's because too often our discussion goes straight into the details of which powers without sorting out the big picture. But there's also a second reason, and I'll end up on this point. At the moment, and it's a bit like this in Labour's documents too, the decision on which powers are available for devolution is jealously held to Whitehall and Westminster's chest. It's one reason why deals take so long to negotiate. And it's one reason why whenever this government introduces a new bit of devolution, it is mirrored automatically by a new mechanism to enable to keep the authorities accountable to Whitehall. And we think we should change that relationship so that devolution policy should be co-designed between a representative body of English local government and the UK government. So those crucial issues, the powers available, the rules for drawing them down, when, if ever, the centre can step in, are threshed out between the centre and local government. And in our paper, Bren and I draw the conclusion that actually if you did these things, you would have moved away from thinking of devolution as a bit of local government policy for Whitehall to worry about towards a genuinely empowered system of English local government. And I don't think we should be aiming for any less than that in government.
Thank you very much, John, for that fascinating and extremely clear summary of at least part of the paper, which, as you say, is on the SLL website. We agreed that questions for you and Bren would follow after Bren has spoken, but I'm exercising my chairman's privilege to raise a question which one or other of you might like to deal with later, or somebody might like to deal with. The assumption behind what you're saying and behind what most people in this debate say is that the effect of devolution, at least in the strong form that you're putting forward and that Emma also described, is that would in itself naturally lead to a greater equalization of prosperity throughout the country. I just wonder, things couldn't be worse than they are at the moment, so it certainly isn't going to do any harm. But is it actually going to have that beneficial effect? And if so, what's the evidence for saying that? So I'll leave that one hanging in the air,
okay,
and give you every opportunity to come back and deal with it later.
And I'm confident that Bren will deal with at least part of that question about resources in what he's about to say. So excellent.
Okay, Bren, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to cover at least a little bit of the ground that John just did, but just in sort of a different context. So I'm going to talk about how to tackle issues of fair funding, co-decision making, and how to improve the system for holding local and devolved government to account. However, I'm also going to talk about what kind of legislative framework might be constructed to facilitate and protect devolution in England. John and Emma have spoken about what devolution in England should seek to achieve and some of the rights and powers which would have to be created to facilitate that. All of these changes and the changes I will speak about in a moment will at some point, however, have to be set out in statute. The question then is, what should that statute seek to do? Should it be another exercise in piecemeal change, or should it aim to create a foundation for future devolution in England? In my view, it should almost certainly be the second option. As I set out in an article I wrote for Labour List recently, we have to think about English devolution as a constitutional as well as an economic project. If we don't, then whatever changes are made will likely exacerbate the ad hoc, incoherent nature of devolution in England as it is now. Governance reform in England can no longer be seen as a simple exercise of reforming local government, but as a transition to devolved government. Without this fundamental shift in mindset, any program of reform is likely to reproduce and, as I say, exacerbate the problems which already exist. So in order to make this transition, governance arrangements and the devolution settlement in England have to be significantly reformed. Reform of English governance structures must address three, in my view, key issues with the current system. First, governance in England is too centralised with too few powers and responsibilities being devolved. What devolution there is incoherent. And three, the UK government machinery is ill-equipped to facilitate sufficient devolution and future devolution in England. The Labour Party's Take Back Control Act will have to address a number of technical issues. However, in my view, the TCBA or whatever other act follows it must also set out a clear constitutional framework for devolution in England, or at least the groundwork for such a framework. Therefore, in my view, the act that brings about these changes must seek to do the following: consolidate, enhance, and protect existing devolution arrangements, create clear mechanisms for future devolution, and ensure that, or at least lay the foundation for ensuring that local and devolved government is properly resourced. There are a number of different devolved arrangements across England with varying powers and responsibilities and funding, as John has pointed out, from no devolution at all to the trailblazer deals for Greater Manchester and West Midlands, with no clear statement of the different powers and responsibilities that are available to different tiers of subnational government. But there is no clear articulation of the relationship between different tiers of government in England. Therefore, the Act should clearly set out the powers and responsibilities available to each tier of local and devolved government in England. In this way, the Act can consolidate and clarify the existing devolution settlement. To achieve this, the Act would need to consolidate and amend some existing legislation, as well as codifying those aspects of devolution in England which fall outside of the existing primary legislation. The Act should enhance the current range of powers and responsibilities available to different tiers of English local and devolved government. John and Emma have spoken about what these might be, and Keir Starmer has set out the following areas in which he intends to some degree to devolve: employment and skills, housing, transport, local and regional infrastructure, climate change policy, culture, and children's services. However, whatever powers and responsibilities are devolved, I would advocate a simplified framework setting out which tiers of government can access different powers and responsibilities. This framework would take into account the existing arrangements and the new powers and responsibilities to be devolved. But beyond consolidating and enhancing the powers and responsibilities available to subnational government in England, the Brown Commission pointed out there should be a constitutional requirement that the political, administrative, and financial autonomy of local government should be respected. John's already touched on this, but I wanted to go into a bit more detail. Such constitutional autonomy requires that the Act should do three things: guarantee that the UK government cannot exercise or interfere with the competences of local or devolved government in England, save for in certain limited circumstances; entrench the powers and responsibilities devolved by the Act. That is, it should set out the procedure by which Parliament can remove or reduce those powers and responsibilities. And third, the Act, in making those entrenchments, should itself be entrenched so that those powers can be protected from being amended by the back door. Entrenching powers in this way will introduce a ratchet effect, such that once powers are drawn down, they could not easily be taken away. Protecting the constitutional autonomy of English subnational government in this way will help facilitate, in my view, a change in the relationship between the UK and subnational governments from a supervisory to a cooperative relationship. In relation to creating clear mechanisms for future devolution, in order to deal with England's incoherent, ad hoc and insecure devolution settlement, clear mechanisms for the devolution of power should be created. The mechanisms for drawing down power should seek to achieve, in my view, the following: a balance between flexibility and coherence, empowering local and devolved government, encourage progressively greater devolution, and simplify the means by which powers and responsibilities are drawn down. Again, John has spoken about this a little bit, and I just wanted to set out what those mechanisms might look like in a bit more detail. So one thing that we've set out in our paper is that if a devolved government, a local devolved government, is seeking to draw down powers or responsibilities which a similar authority already enjoys, then it should be able to do those. It should be able to do so by right. That is, there should be no preconditions for doing so, thus empowering devolved authorities. This is a great deal simpler and more transparent than the current system of ad hoc devolution deals, as John mentioned. However, if a devolved or local government is seeking new powers, they're not being drawn down before or to a similar tier of government, then it could be required to meet certain clearly defined statutory requirements designed to ensure that it can carry out those new responsibilities. But that changes the onus away from doing a deal to meeting requirements that are clear and transparent. The two mechanisms I've just described will, in my view, create a balance between flexibility and coherence, will empower local and devolved authorities, promote transparency, and create a system which supports progressively greater devolution. This should also be accompanied with a guarantee that once a power is devolved to another body, to a local devolved government, no other body can exercise that power within the relevant area. Too often, local authorities share responsibilities with the national body, which can override them in their own geographical area. This leads to uncertainty, less effective government, and a waste of resources. I'm going to talk briefly now about co-governance. A key part of enhancing devolution now and in the future is the creation of co-governance structures for England, as John indicated, particularly, in our view, through the creation of a nationally representative body, which would at least be consulted upon in relation to English matters, and which may, at least in respect of funding, have some role in agreeing future funding allocations for local and devolved government in England. And the important leads me on to funding more generally. It is my understanding that currently it is the Labour Party's policy to move towards 3-year funding settlements for local government and for departmental style funding for settlements for trailblazer CLAs. That is a block grant to be spent as determined by the CLA. This is clearly a step in the right direction. However, as we indicated in our recent briefing paper and echoed by a recent paper called A Labour Vision for Community Power, which John spoke about earlier, must be constructed on a system of equalisation. Equalisation is fiscal resources are distributed across a national territory in a way that seeks to ensure that broadly all areas receive equal resources. Put simply, this requires the redistribution of resources from richer parts of the country to poorer ones, to ensure that every part of the country has the capacity to deliver for their communities. I don't want to get too technical with this, but put simply, the system of equalisation can be more or less complicated. It can simply ensure that the amount of money an area has to spend on core public services is uniform across the territory, or it can seek to do more than this, perhaps seeking to address historic underinvestment in infrastructure, for example. In my view, if we do not eventually move towards a system of robust equalisation, we will not be able to level up our most deprived areas. However, as I said earlier, how funding is allocated, even through a statutory mechanism, should not simply be a matter for central government. Whatever changes are made to the level of funding or to that formula should be made on the basis of consultation and consent through the medium of a representative body for England, which will provide an added measure of security for that system of funding and will empower devolved and local government in England. I'm going to talk finally now about accountability. So one of the issues that faces local and devolved government at the moment is a lack of clarity around their financial affairs, particularly because devolution creates new challenges for political and fiscal accountability. Whitehall's role as the collective accounting officer for public funding has already created constraints on devolution. As more powers and funds are devolved, the risks and the need for more effective accountability will grow. But if accountability is upwards to the centre, then devolution will be hampered. So a new framework for holding local government to account could be based on the creation of a new devolved local government audit office, a bit like the NAO, but for local government. And that goes a step further than the government's plan, which is to create a new successor organisation to the FRA, yes, Financial Regulation Authority, which, in our view, would refocus purely on local and devolved government. Beyond that, if we want local and devolved government to be successfully scrutinised, that needs to be done locally, principally through the ballot box, but also by local scrutiny committees. And an important part of that is having information available to them so they can do that. So in our view, the the Take Back Control Act should do the following: enable national accounting officers to devolve their statutory responsibilities to appropriate officers and local authorities or CLAs, create a new statutory public audit office for local authorities and CLAs with intervention powers, and enable central government, after consultation with a representative body of local authorities, to publish minimum standards for local scrutiny and establish principles for the operation of local government, including standards for conduct in public life, transparency and openness to scrutiny by the public and the media. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Bren. Very, very interesting. Your point about redistribution probably answers the question I posed at the beginning. So thank you for doing that. Now we're going to have a slightly more open session now for questions and discussion. And if I may, I will start with a question that Henry has put in the chat, which is probably more directed at Emma, who's now, I think, left us. But I'm going to read out Henry's question, and then anyone who feels able to answer it can do so, particularly perhaps either John or Bren. Henry says, if Labour support the cooperative with a substantial fund to build more houses, so I take it he means if there's a cooperative business, a developer which is has a cooperative basis, and it gets some funding to build more houses, can the local authority at the same time cap the rent for the benefit of those people who are going to be occupying the houses, assuming that they are to be let out as for rental purposes? Would anybody like to comment on that? Maybe any of the other members of the audience might have a view about that, particularly one or two of the housing experts whom I see, fortunately, we have here. David Watkinson looks as if he might have something to say about it, but I can't quite tell whether he's leaning forward with a view to speaking or just leaning forward as a change of position.
I'm leaning forward with a view to speaking, Steve.
Excellent. Right, go ahead.
Thanks. The answer to Henry's question is basically it depends on the grant of that the council makes to the cooperative and the terms of it. Just to put this into context, of course, local authorities have the power to set the rent of the public housing that they own. And that is a statutory power, and it's a power to set a reasonable rent. That is a reasonable rent not a market rent. That is the limit of local authorities' powers at the present time, because we no longer have an effective system of rent control in the private sector since the introduction of assured short-hold tenancies in 1988 and 1996. Whether or not there should be a system of rent control in the private sector is a matter which we've been debating certainly in our subcommittee for some time now, and we have indeed put forward a proposal for a system of rent control in the private sector to be introduced. But just going back to Henry's question more precisely, yes, that could happen if that was part of the arrangements between the local authority and the cooperative. In other words, they could achieve by private contract what at the present time the statutory system doesn't allow.
And we've got a hand up from Liz Davies, so I'm glad we prompted you to comment on this, Liz. Go ahead.
I'm going to say a similar thing to David. So absolutely, there's no statutory requirement whereby rents in the cooperative movement can be capped, but it could be achieved through contract as conditions of contract as a result of grants given by councils or indeed by if grants were given by central government. And then a separate point, which does follow on from David, that it's hard to see how levelling up can be achieved without also looking at how to tackle private rents. And to a certain extent, that achieves geographically a slightly different point than the traditional view of levelling up, which is the idea that the North and the Midlands need catching up with London and the South. And I know that you've been saying it's much more subtle than that. I appreciate that. And John obviously knows Southampton very well, and Southampton is definitely a place that would benefit from proper Labour levelling up. But private rents in London, in Bristol, in most of the southeast, indeed in Manchester, and participants on this call from pretty well most of England are going to say they're spiralling out of control. And so levelling up must, it seems to me, take account of the need to provide affordable housing for everybody. Some of that can be dealt with by a very large scale program of social housing, because obviously then you have market forces bringing the market rents down in the private rented sector because there's less demand for the private rented sector. I hope Labour will stick to, what it's been previously saying about wanting to make social housing the second largest tenure in Britain, in England after home ownership. It's important that we embark on that, but it is also important, it seems to me, that there is some method of getting to grips with spiralling private rented sector rents, and Sadiq Khan has been calling for legislation to allow him to have powers to provide local levels, or at least to regulate rent increases once the tenancy has been entered into. There's the Bristol Living Rent Commission, which we had a fascinating webinar on back in July, that is essentially wanting the same powers. And it seems to me that the way to deal with unaffordable private rents is to look at what's needed locally in different areas, and to have legislation when we have a Labour government that allows for that flexibility. And I'd be interested in what the speakers think.
Yes, I'll hand over to John in a moment. Perhaps he's about to say what I'm about to say, which is that it may be that the ambition to have the ability to control rents to a much greater extent than we have at the moment it would be part of the devolution settlement envisaged by the Take Back Control Act, and it would be an argument in favour of that process, that then you could achieve the sort of perhaps variable or differential control over rents that, Liz, you're talking about. Let me I'm only expressing all of that in quite a tentative way. Let me go back to John to comment perhaps on what you've been hearing about rents on the one hand, and further comments on the more general issue, if you'd like to do so.
Yes, what I wanted to try and do was to stress the way that our devolution discussion needs to enable us to bring together different strands of public policy to enable local areas to have a coherent overall strategy. So if you go back to Henry's question, one of the crucial things, and I'm not quite sure where this has got to in the Labour Party policy discussion, but it was floated by Lisa Nandy earlier this year, was the idea of enabling the public sector to purchase land at pre-planning permission prices. And that would be hugely disruptive to the current stranglehold that the private developers have got over land supply, the release of land, and so on. Now, not only does that directly feed into the cost equations that are involved when you want to set rents, but secondly, I don't see actually how we will produce the sort of housing numbers we want without strategies that get local communities on board. I mean, it's all right, blood-curdling rhetoric about, backing the builders, not the blockers, but actually most people are actually quite sensitive about their local environment as well. And so the ability through these sorts of mechanisms, social land trusts, cooperatives and whatever, to produce the sort of housing that people in local communities say they need, rather than it certainly happens where I'm sitting in Winchester, people resist it because they actually know the housing won't ever be used by local people. So these things come together. And then I think the rent control, I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all, but that probably falls into the category that Brendan and I have talked about, if you like, about discretionary powers. There may be parts of the country where it is not particularly relevant to get into the area of rent controls, because actually these are at the moment, they have not been leveled up and they don't have huge demands on the private sector. There are clearly other areas where it is by far and away the most pressing social and economic problem within a particular area. And I think that's why we've tried to lay the stress on a basic level of empowerment, but beyond that, really the ability for people to construct the powers they want in their local area because it suits their needs. So I hope that, I'm not a housing expert, but I hope that the framework we've tried to lay out gives us precisely that sort of flexibility. But it does depend on some of the basic powers, like, for example, public sector acquisition of land being available to local authorities. Otherwise, they'll have very little ability to influence what happens in local housing strategy.
One thing.
Sorry, just to say, John, on that last point, that there are provisions in the Levelling Up bill which would enable transactions, would enable local authorities to buy land in certain circumstances without having to pay what's called hope value.
Yeah,
it's a fairly limited power, at least at the moment under Michael Gove's draftsmanship, but it is there, and it's quite a good beginning, at least, I think, actually. Bren, sorry, you wanted to come in, did you?
Yeah, so there's a bit of work that we did a little while ago around with the Brown Commission, looking at the question of subsidiarity, and it's something I perhaps should have talked about in my main talk. But there's a way that you can construe if you impose a duty of subsidiarity, generally, then you can use it as an interpretive tool by the courts, such that if you give local or devolved authorities relatively broad and powers around certain areas, then those powers could be read down in such a way as to allow them to take regulatory actions that could encompass things like rent control. So, for example, if it was given a power to or responsibility over ensuring that there is sufficient and affordable accommodation within its geographical area, well, a necessary part of that might be the imposition of rent controls. And if you have an expansive subsidiarity duty, then that may be a necessary part of giving that force.
Thank you. Now, let me just open this up and see if there's anyone else on the call who hasn't yet spoken who would like to ask a question or make a comment. Please feel free if you would like to do so. Yes, Dan.
Hi
Dan, and then Hannah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion about the housing and so on. I kind of wondered what other people's thoughts were about when it comes to green belts and so forth, because the green belt includes farming, which I believe is agricultural. I don't think it's the country. I think that a field covered with chemicals that destroys every bit of nature, apart from that one crop, shouldn't be regarded as countryside. A field full of cows that just shit on a piece of grass, and we say, well, we can't build on there. That's the green belt. That's the country. It must be preserved. That to me is preposterous. And as I think David Lammy said a while ago, it also includes loads of car parks, golf courses, things that are, you know, are not nature. I think we should be renaming the green belt as the nature belt and only having forests, rivers, places where there are biodiversity, not places where humans have destroyed everything except for what's of use for us. And I think if we did that, that would open up a lot of land which could be much more productively employed. And what I mean by productively employed is that communities could live there, and we could actually be wild parts of it within the community, so that nature can live alongside human beings. So
interesting point that the green belt has a contribution to make to levelling up. I haven't heard that one before, but you put your point very persuasively. Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm just going to move over to Hannah now and then Daniel.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that the Take Control Act is going to need to embrace broader constitutional reform? So we're obviously talking about the devolutionary aspects. Really, we've just been talking, I think, mainly about the English aspects. And I wonder if the Take Back Control Act, or probably better, a package of acts, a packets of legislation, are also likely to bracket off. Let's just take it as the parts of the Brown Report, as there's plenty of other reforms we could talk about. But I'm mainly thinking about House of Lords reform. Addition of economic and social rights was a key part of this. Bren, you mentioned the entrenchment of these devolved powers to ensure they're lasting. I wondered if that was a reference to reforms to the upper chamber, or you had something else in mind. And you also mentioned
these are all absolutely crucial questions, but I'm a little bit hesitant to open up a discussion about them this evening, in that they're sort of only indirectly related to levelling up. But I can tell you that the Society's Constitution Group has been actively studying these questions and working their way through them. And if I promise that we're going to have a webinar on this in the near future, would you bear with us? Let me just...
sorry, Stephen, just before we go off, not to support Hannah with no answer at all. I think that the Take Back Control Act is intended to only deal with devolution in England. But as we've said in our paper, that doesn't preclude, and it's not dependent upon, other broader constitutional reforms. Entrenchment, I could have a long conversation with you about entrenchment, as Stephen will tell you. But that's we
hard to have a short conversation about entrenchment.
Others on the Brown Commission report.
Yeah,
but the entrenchment mechanism I was talking about there wouldn't rely on any reform to the upper house.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Daniel.
Yeah, so I was just going to make one quick point in rent control now and ask about accountability. But just in rent control, one of the things that I think you have to be very careful about, if you take a whole area and you say you're going to have rent control, most landlords or small landlords, they only have 2 or 3 properties and they're all buy to rent. The moment in London, private landlords are selling up, and it's putting already massive pressure on the housing market already for especially lower income. And I think you have to. I believe in rent control. They have them in places like New York, where I've been, and in Germany as well. But I think you have to be very, very careful about its implementation. Anyway, that was just a point. Accountability. For local authorities is one of the, I'm a former local councillor myself from Lambeth, and I think it's very difficult sometimes for local authorities to control things, and also some local authorities will care about certain issues and some won't give much of a care at all. You know, when it comes to, for example, I'm a tenant lawyer, housing lawyer. And when it comes to tenants' rights, complaints, and dealing with tenants, some were absolutely appalling and don't care. And one of the issues is I worry about. I mean, I agree completely in what you're saying and levelling up, and I'm hugely enthusiastic. But I think one of the arguments will be this idea of accountability. What if you have local authorities that don't care about, you know, their tenants' rights, for example, don't want to implement policies that, for example, support youth activities in a local borough, which was something that, you know, I used to get involved in. And I worry about, just one point. I mean, you mentioned scrutiny committees, very limited powers, and it's very difficult for councillors to be able to scrutinise officers. They're not qualified. They try their best, you know, working part-time. So really it's accountability. That's my question.
Brent's just informed me in a message that he has to go in a moment or two. So I'm sure you'd like me to thank him very much on your behalf for his contribution. Then I'm now going to ask John, please, to respond to Daniel's comments and anything else that you've heard.
Yeah, and the answer, I think, Dan, is we have to take a deep breath and we have to say, how do you make a system of local accountability work? I was in government when we tried to monitor a 360-degree performance of all local government and all public services in an area. And everybody spent their entire time filling in reports for auditors and whatever. It's actually an illusion to think that the centre can create a system of accountability that ensures that local authorities deliver well. And I believe that very, very firmly indeed. And so what's happened is that system was abandoned by the Conservative government. They then got rid of the statutory audit function entirely, and that was a mistake. So what we should have done is actually I mean, you could say councillors don't know how to do scrutiny, nor do MPs, but we have a system of select committees which actually works quite well. And it works well because they're properly resourced, they're independent from the officer structure, and they're able to do the job. So you could actually have really powerful scrutiny at local level and extend it over public service budgets generally. You could reintroduce, and Bren was talking about this, a statutory audit function with, if necessary, powers to intervene when a Woking or a Thurrock or something is coming along the way. But this is a major issue, but having been at the centre of government, it is extremely difficult to believe that Whitehall can set up a system of accountability that actually works at local level. And I think we're better to start from the question of, let's look at all the flaws you have correctly identified and say, how would you tackle those at local level? And you do, at the end of the day, have to allow for the possibility that maybe what you have to do with bad councillors is vote them out. And and that's what they did in Slough just recently, unfortunately, where a Labour council lost, but it was the backlash against having lost control of the financial affairs of the local authority. The same happened in different politics in Woking for the same reason. So at the end of the day, we can trust the voters as well, I think.
That sounds like a good note on which to end. I'm going to wind up there. I want to say thank you very much to our administrator, Rachel, who I think may still be listening. And can I say to anyone on the call that her email address is administrator@societyoflabourlawyers.org.uk. And if you want to find out more about joining society or becoming involved in any of the discussions, including Hannah discussions about the future of the broader constitution, then by all means email Rachel, and she'll try and get you involved. I'd like to thank Jamie, who helped to set this up and helped us with the publicity. And I'd like to thank everyone who has participated, especially our speakers, only one of whom has survived the course to the end, namely John. But I think it's been an incredibly wide-ranging and complex discussion. I suspect that we could easily spend a week talking about this, and we probably wouldn't have covered all the ground. But in an hour and a quarter, I don't think we've done too badly. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.